Rick Rubin doesn't really know how to run a soundboard, I would imagine, or produce music as an engineer, nor does Jay-Z or Kanye. But they're still the one that's directing it, and they're the one that all this value and grandiosity is attributed to. And so I think it's largely going to be along that frame where you'll sit in a room with an AI engineer and you'll just sort of have this idea and go back and forth with other bright minds.
Hello, and welcome to AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. I'm a journalist, I'm a human, and I'm curious about AI. And a few weeks ago, I was in Miami at a dinner during a Consensus Tech Conference. I met this young, smart guy who started talking about the software he was building. And not talking about it in an annoying tech bro way, but more in a really thoughtful, earnest, and curious way. And by talking about how he builds software, that doesn't really do it justice. He told me about a module he created called Auto Builds, where two different AI models essentially go to war with each other, arguing back and forth, and building an application piece by piece while he directs it all from above. And he was not like a coder, right? This is kind of vibe coding magic. He told me about this research agent that briefs him every morning. He told me somewhere around our second round of drinks, roughly how much you should be spending on AI tokens and why, if you're spending a lot more than that, you're doing it wrong. How token maxing is dumb. I remember thinking, this guy knows a lot, and I wish someone had a microphone at this dinner table. So this episode is my attempt to recreate that dinner with the microphone. My guest is Elijah Spencer, Chief of Staff at Miden. And here's the thing. You've probably never heard of him. And that's kind of the point. Because when you hear about AI, you usually hear from one of two voices. The CEO discussing transformation at 30,000 feet, or the founder who, surprise, has an AI product to sell you. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of those, right? I mean, I've hosted plenty of the conversations on this podcast, and I enjoy them, and we'll have more. But the voice you rarely hear from is the practitioner, the operator, the person inside a small team who is quietly, obsessively pushing the boundary of what this tech can actually do. These power users are, I would argue, the true bleeding edge of AI right now. And I would put Elijah in the top 1%, if not 0.1% of elite power AI users. And in some ways, I really think this, he and his cohort are in some ways ahead of the labs themselves. Hear me out. The workflows that Elijah is cobbling together today that are, using in many ways, kind of really trying to generate things together and create these harnesses and connect this to that. Those are almost like a sneak preview. Those are more, he's making these custom handmade things that are kind of beyond the default settings that you have right now through the tools by OpenAI or Anthropic. There's no tool that exists that's doing what Elijah is doing. But that tool probably exists in 6 months or a year. So it's almost like a sneak preview of what will be mainstream 6 months or a year from now, once they've kind of sanded off the edges and made it a little easier for the masses. Now, a little context on our conversation. Elijah's company happens to be, in many ways, in the crypto space. It doesn't matter. Almost nothing in this conversation is really about crypto. It's more just an example. When he explains how he built a financial dashboard for his startup in a week because the ops team was tracking everything in a spreadsheet by hand, that can translate to any business, marketing, construction, legal, your business. The principles travel easily. And we get into all of it. The morning research agent that reads papers, Twitter, and Reddit through the lens of his exact setup. Like an intern who actually knows you. He has a social listening system that pings his phone when a story is breaking relevant to him. And this is not Google Alerts, right? It's far more custom. And that let his team catch a quantum computing development within hours, not days. And they built a campaign around it on the fly. Or the app he built that connects to the strap on his wrist and trains his heart rate in real time. This first working version happened in 45 minutes. He also has a theory that the next great companies will be built the way Rick Rubin makes albums. The director doesn't touch the soundboard. He also shares why he has sworn off bloated AI memory files. And he has genuinely useful advice toward the end on where a total beginner should start. There are probably some acronyms he'll toss out here that might make no sense to you. That's okay. Even if 20 to 30% of what you hear is a little fuzzy from the tech terms, I think you'll still get a lot out of hearing how he's approaching using AI in these pretty advanced ways. Plus, there's a thing he told his own family to do, and that costs nothing and takes just 5 minutes. So with that tease, please enjoy my conversation with Elijah Spencer, Chief of Staff at Miden. Elijah, welcome to AI Curious.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. This is fun.
All right. So I really wish we could have had a microphone at our dinner table in Miami from a few weeks back. But let's just like time travel back there for a moment. And I want to like start out from the jump with one of the favorite things you can do with AI right now. Give listeners just a quick tease of some cool shit you're building that could not have been done a year or two before.
I think about like a year or two ago, you look at like you were very much constrained to the actual application environment that like OpenAI or Anthropic wanted you to experience their models within. And I think like third-party harnesses, whether it be OpenClaw or Hermes, and some people would argue Hermes isn't even like a third-party harness. But I think that what you can do with them now in terms of development is really interesting to me, only from the onset that you can basically build your own workflows that are not specific to any one model. And we talked a lot about this at dinner, but basically like a lot of the workflow for me now looks like, honestly, I usually will start in Claude design, and I'll look at like specifically like what kind of design I actually want the app to have, if it is an app that has a GUI or a UX. And then I'll hand that off to Claude. Claude will build out the PRD and the architecture brief. And then, as we talked about dinner again, I hand it off to AutoBuild. And AutoBuild is my module that basically goes back and forth between Codex and Opus 4.8. And basically, they go to war with each other and just develop module by module, basically pair programming. And what I really like about developing this way
can you make it even more concrete? What's a thing for listeners? Like, what is a thing that you're building? Like some kind of example of like a website or application, like an example of like, okay, I have an idea for X. Sure. And I start in Claude design, and then almost autonomously, all of this stuff works to make it happen. And then like a day later, you have this thing built. Kind of paint that picture for me.
An example of like something I built last week actually is our head of ops actually came to me, and he said that we were tracking everything right now essentially through a spreadsheet. And we have a ops team member that's basically going in and updating this manually from the bank accounts we have, on-chain transactions, things like that. And he asked me if we could build something that would basically allow us to calculate burn, calculate exactly how much we have in each account. And so one of the things that I did was like, I looked at how we can collate all those different accounts together, all of our on-chain transactions, and get a good cohesive view, almost like you would expect from Monarch or another budgeting app for your personal life, but almost for a startup. And so I basically brought that into Claude design, developed UX straight away, developed the brief and architecture, and then passed it to AutoBuild. And then we had a working copy within a week, basically. And so like that's an example of how fast you can deploy these things in a corporate environment or a startup environment.
Awesome. Thank you. And how about give me an example of an agent you have, maybe perhaps as we speak? What's an agentic flow or workflow that you've spun up that's doing things almost round the clock for you? And you're like, oh, that's now done.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest time sucks in all of AI as things start to evolve and kind of we reach this ad infinitum speed of development is research. And we've spoken about this too, but one of the agents that I'll look at like every morning, quite honestly, is basically a research agent that parses research papers, Twitter, and Reddit. And it's looking specifically at what's new on the harness front, what's new on the model front, what's new on the jailbreaking front as well. Just from the onset of like how much capability are black hats and red teamers actually having in the way of using these models and things like that. That really interests me. And so I like to look at that and kind of get a digest of that and really what it means in context. This agent actually has context into my personal workflow and development. And so it knows exactly, like it knows how I'm using Hermes agent. It knows how I'm using Honcho for persistent memory. It knows what types of models I'm using. It knows basically how I have my VPSs set up both for production applications and development. And so it's able to kind of parse through that lens, just like if you had an intern that was basically going and doing research for you, you would want them to have all that context so that they're not filtering it through the lens of just general usefulness. And I think that's where, quite honestly, like a lot of the time, like markdown files and context.md files come in handy.
Yeah. Can I share, since we've spoken, partly inspired by you and others, my version of that, I have my quasi agents I affectionately refer to as George for AI Curious George, named for the monkey Curious George. And every morning now I have at 5 a.m., George goes out and, to your point about context, first gets up to speed on the AI Curious podcast. Does an exhaustive look at past episodes, gets the briefing of what this podcast is all about, editorial themes, looks at the editorial calendar ahead of time, and then scours the internet for latest stories and research and trends, important topics, then creates ideas for future episodes and topics and guests. And as a spreadsheet that I share with my team that's looking at possibilities, makes recommendations for me. And then I'm proud to figure it out. It takes some time to figure this out. Like, oh, how do I make sure he has read-write access to Google Sheets and so on? You figure all that out. And now George is adding possibilities. I then, keeping the human in the loop, I say, cool, this episode idea is greenlit. Now I want you to help me figure out who the best guest would be. And George helps with all of that and then maintains. And even, it's funny, even as a very live example, the other day, I'm like, you know what? We're going to interview Elijah on this day. We're going to bump this episode up. Can you please update the calendar? And George then does all the grunt work of updating all of this. And so that's something that's concretely helped me. Is that kind of the flavor of the kind of stuff you guys are building?
Totally. Yeah. I would say I'd say when you're in an organization or a startup, you have to be a lot more careful about agentic workflows, only because they usually involve multiple people. I think that's one of the benefits when you have a smaller team, is that usually they're all bought in, or they should all be bought in on using agentic workflows. And I think in that context of like how you're using George, I think for your purposes, it makes total sense. And it makes a lot of sense that you would want to use it in that way, specifically because it helps you with the overworld context. Basically, it's like that context layer that you don't even have, in the sense that this is sort of the narrative I want to construe, and this is how I want to talk about it. Who is the best guest for this, right? And that's not something that you or I just have in our lexicon of understanding of, oh, it would be this person or that person, because there's always new names coming up in this space as well, as you know. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. And for us, I think at Miden, it's like I would say we're primarily focused on solving these like core business problems. So like one of those is like, for us, is like BD right now. We're focused on really intently on outreach and things along those lines. And so we even have like a BD tracker that we built internally that we're starting to use, where we have like a social listening dashboard that basically gives us an understanding of like sort of like the tweets that are coming up in our space, all that sort of stuff. And so these sort of like core problems that we view as like really evergreen, or at least how I think about AI-driven development, is that if it's something that you foresee being a problem for the long term, it will usually make sense to develop an app around or develop a more concrete process. If it's something that is more ad hoc, or you don't really see it as something that you need to have moving forward, or you're going to want to build on top of, an agentic workflow might make more sense, because it doesn't necessarily need a GUI or a UX. You may not need multiple users for it. And transparently, that's one of the, I think like a lot of the next phase of really how people are going to be looking at agentic development and agentic driven workflows within the context of organizations is probably through Slack bots.
Interesting.
And I primarily say that because like, if you have a Slack bot and it's living in your channels and it's living in your chats and it has all the context on your company, it has all your meeting transcripts, it has all of your calendar information. It basically is like, basically a one-to-one employee just living in Slack. Being able to call that at a moment's notice and asking it specifically what it thinks about an issue in GitHub, when you're having a conflict between two engineers, or you're wondering like, is it better to optimize for a bigger event at this conference versus two smaller events at these other conferences, and getting an instant opinion on it based on everything it knows about your Notion and your Google Docs and everything along those lines. It's super, super powerful. And I think not just for conflict resolution, but also for just helping sort of like spin things up as well. I can't think of the name of the company right now, but there's some company that's been really big on Twitter, and they have just exactly this. It's literally a Slack bot. They were coming under fire for a little bit because their sort of like outbounding strategy was that the bot would message everybody in their Slack and even external channels. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's something that we've even looked at a little bit as well. And it's something that, especially I think like the way to start with those things is like starting with a workflow that's driven in Slack, right? Where like if you want to have like proactive sort of content generation, you can have it sort of message the person in Slack that should be reviewing that. And then go ahead.
I want to get into a bit in the mechanics of setting that up. I think that'd be helpful for listeners. Sure. Before we do, can you give I wanted us to start with some juicy things you're doing. And then you mentioned Miden. Elijah, give listeners a sense of kind of what your role is at Miden. And then kind of more broadly, what are the main kind of like use cases and like buckets, if you will, of where you've injected AI into what you're doing? Because my sense is it's pretty much everywhere. Like, so as chief of staff, so you have your tendrils in all parts of the business. We'd love to kind of give like a lay of the lands of where you've injected, whether it's by building apps or agentic workflows or recurring tasks. Kind of like if you can give us a sense of the verticals, but kind of start with kind of your a bit of a context of what you're up to there.
Definitely, yeah. So Miden is a privacy-preserving blockchain built for institutions. And as chief of staff, I basically come alongside Azim, which is our business co-founder. And so I'll help alongside like BD-related tasks, ops-related tasks, marketing-related tasks, basically those three verticals and lanes. And so generally how I think about this is like, for me, in a startup, like you always want to be thinking about like what your constraining issue is. Like what is the thing that's like, if unblocked, would basically flow open the floodgates for you, right? And that's really like anybody that's at a startup is always thinking about that at a top level, I think. And I think like what's unique as a chief of staff and in this role is that like I'm actually in a position, especially through agentic driven development, is to actually solve those fundamental problems more so than being in like a marketing role or a content role or otherwise, right? And so I think like, and this is why too, I personally see a lot of value coming out of operations teams within different companies as it relates to AI, because they're so agnostic of any one specific business function in context. They have the ability to kind of, parachute in and develop something around a process and then parachute back out. It's very similar to like what Emily Choi and the team at Coinbase, their operations team has kind of developed. And so I see a lot more people that are in the sort of like, even if you are a marketer or you're somebody in BD or something along those lines, if you have that kind of like top level autonomy and you're in a position to do that, I've seen a lot more people kind of go towards that sort of frame. And so like for us specifically, like I'd say our three main apps that like we're focused on right now in terms of developing internally is like the social listing dashboard, like I shared about. I think like having a social graph and an understanding of realistically like what's happening in your space and the types of topics that are going on is really, really important.
And can you kind of paint a picture of what that looks like? Is it literally like a dashboard showing like you have different topics and subtopics and you're asking it to go out on X, go out on LinkedIn, go out on wherever else and kind of summarize what's happening? And tell me more about what that looks like.
So we chose to do it a little bit differently. Instead of a dashboard, we actually have it inbounding to Telegram. As you may or may not know, everything in crypto lives in Telegram. And so it's kind of like the default channel. And so we have it inbounding to Telegram, and it'll flag tweets that are basically popping off across institutional adoption, privacy, RWAs, tokenization, various other topics in our space. And especially like major news stories that we kind of see as like being a big narrative. And an example of like where this has really, really helped us is a couple of weeks back, there was a paper that was flagged by this process, basically that was talking about that Google had made this breakthrough with basically this quantum breakthrough with post-quantum technology. And so they basically, what they did is they recognized that like Q day, or basically the day that, quantum non-quantum resistant encryption will break, is coming up much sooner than otherwise. And that created an opportunity for us to basically fill in and create this sort of like micro campaign around almost on the fly. Because we were so on the ball about it. Like otherwise, like I think we probably would have taken, between 36 and 48 hours to actually catch it, instead of catching it within like the first 5 or 6 hours. And so that's an example of like where having your sort of like hand on the pulse of like what's happening socially can be really helpful. Another case of this, I think, is like, and this is something, if we were more of a community driven project, this is definitely something we would build out. But I think for the purposes of most crypto projects, they'd also be well suited to build something out along the lines of having an idea of like where their community kind of sees them and positions them. We're more aiming towards institutional audiences. So we're more focused.
It's easy to imagine for almost any company, you kind of want to know what your perception is in the world.
Totally.
Right? So being able to kind of have a sentiment analysis like of yourself, what's your kind of Q score, if you will, out there in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's sentiment analysis. There's tell me some more things that you guys, some other kind of like systems you guys have built at Miden with AI in different kind of buckets and verticals.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the main things that we're working on right now is like a content workflow. So specifically, we're focused on creating content that isn't AI generated necessarily. That's one of the things that our mutual friend Ben and I have had good discussions about.
Shout out to Ben Schiller, friend of the pod and friend of real life. So yes,
it's a great guy.
So go on. Sorry.
Right, yeah, no, but we've had great conversations about it, because I think the majority of the time, like most people assume that you're going to use AI just to develop an article straight off the rip and then just try to post it and pull one over on people that like it's fully AI developed. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And, it's something that we've had discussions internally. And I don't think that the majority of people are thinking about articles in the right way, or long form content in the right way as it relates to Twitter as well. I think articles are one of the really undersold aspects, to be totally honest, of engagement on Twitter currently. But for us, what we're actually focused on developing here is like looking at those topics that are coming up and about, and then developing different hooks or narratives around it as it relates to Miden specifically. And also positioning it in line with the way that we're talking about things across our different co-founders as well. So I can't get too into that, but one of the core things is like, as with any company, like if you had like an editorial hook or an idea for an article, it wouldn't make sense for a policy or a legal person to talk about something in tech necessarily, unless it had a policy or legal frame to it. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at, is like specifically how we develop that workflow to have that specific frame built in for the founder that it's going to be written by ultimately.
Any other key use cases or buckets that you want to share that you've been using?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really powerful is specifically like research into adoption, specifically for crypto. More specifically, I think it's like, you generally don't see too many crypto companies that have a good understanding of where tech is actually being adopted in their vertical or sphere. I've talked about many times with Azim and the rest of the team, is that, like for all intents and purposes, like, crypto is tokens for the most part, right? The business is tokens. And so like if you're trying to actually build a business like we are, and trying to actually create real revenue and real value for the world, you want to have an idea of like specifically where your tech is being adopted. And so we actually, I'm actually in the middle of rebooting it currently, but we have a workflow that essentially would grab all the different news of people adopting digital assets, and it would identify the different competitors specifically and where they're at as well, and look at specifically how likely they are to adopt specific types of digital asset technologies, whether it be tokenization, RWAs, what have you. And why that's helpful for us is just having a sort of an index or a pulse again on kind of where things are going, in the sense that we don't really know. I don't think anybody really knows exactly when things are going to pop off in the West, in the United States specifically, in terms of adoption. But having an idea specifically of where people are actually making money right now and creating new value in the sense of actual real adoption for crypto and crypto technology is really helpful for us. And so that's one of the other things. And then, like I shared as well, like we're building out like our own BD platform currently. I think that for all intents and purposes, like BD and crypto is kind of a different process than you'll see a lot of the time in traditional B2B companies. And so building out, you don't necessarily have to build out your own BD infrastructure, but it can be really helpful. And that
and
also
just a couple quick things. First, on the research front, I think it's worth pointing out that the majority of listeners are not into crypto, but still every company probably has, or even a solo person, if whatever you are, there's probably some area where research is useful for you, right? And building a workflow that is able to do in-depth research analysis on whether competitors or possible new markets you want to break into, whatever. There's a million use cases, right? Like that is enormously useful to having effectively a free, experienced, smart research analyst at your disposal 24/7. And you're building a workflow that lets you get, sounds like daily briefings or however you're structuring it, but you have this workflow that's giving you tons of research you wouldn't have had otherwise. That's really smart. And then on the BD front, I'm curious if similarly, almost every company needs to think about some kind for growth or customers or partnerships. Think about how to keep track of all of that, right? How to like keep track of, okay, there are some cold leads, there are some warm leads. We met this person at a conference. We got this inbounds, and it's hard to keep track of all that, right? Obviously, there's all kinds of companies starting from Salesforce down under or on down of like who are trying to sell solutions for CRMs effectively, right? But it's all basically BD and CRM. So we'd love to hear a little more. And I think it's, actually, as an aside, I have my own system that I built for that too, a hyper customized just for me and my businesses and in this podcast or as a speaker, a CRM system. Would love to hear more about kind of with that context, a little more about kind of what the BD system does, what it tracks, and how is it agentic, and what do the agents do in that workflow?
Definitely. Yeah. So for us, like the way we think about a CRM or about BD in general is that we tend to think that like relationships should be owned by one person. Generally, that's how things will move along most quickly and most smoothly. And in addition to that, in crypto, it's like the majority of touch points you'll have with teams is not so much like, as I'm sure you've experienced with different crypto conferences, it's like you'll have things that won't move for like 6 months. And then you'll see somebody at a conference, and then all of a sudden an MOU is signed and you're ready to go. And so for us, it's like we want to have a very lightweight system and a very lightweight approach to that. So we still have statuses and a Kanban board and basically swim lanes for how a deal moves across the board. But one of the things that we're actually building in, and this will make use of our research that I talked to you about in terms of who's adopting, and it ties in specifically with those competitors, is for us, one of our core solutions is Guardian, and Guardian is basically state management for the chain. Provides a couple other things in terms of like privacy and also as well like revenue controls and compliance and things along those lines. And so we're really focused on, like I said, one of our core priorities is like BD and outbounding right now. And so we'll be building a agentic workflow into the CRM that'll basically allow for an outbounding approach to happen right there as the news basically makes its way in on who's actually adopting. And so the way that'll work is basically looking at like those competitors, evaluating the competitors based on like what they're actually doing, and then crafting outreach and basically finding connection points where it actually matters. And I won't go too into depth.
So if there's news, if your research, if there's a catalyst that's driven by your agent that is surfacing some news about adoption or research, you said, we just discovered through our agentic research, there's adoption story in Argentina. I'm making this up. That is a news nugget that would then be automatically deployed as outbound using your CRM to some other, whether it's people in the media or a possible partner or someone like, is that through an email or through a, how does it work? What are the mechanics of that? Am I getting it right? And what does it look like concretely?
Yeah. So backing it up a little bit. So there's two different ways to evaluate it. You can evaluate it, and how it pulls in for us is like every Monday it does a sweep, and it looks at like Google News, it looks at Twitter primarily as the two sources. And it looks at like which companies are adopting digital assets more broadly, right? Or crypto in general, right? Whether this be deal with stablecoin payments or, Stripe integrated with WAP or whatever it might be, right? And so it looks at more broadly, like specifically where adoption is happening. And then it looks at if there's something specific to that region, like maybe that region just created some regulatory framework that is providing clarity, pun not intended, for that specific area of the world, or it specifically is related to that type of product, right? And so what it'll do then is it'll capture their competitors. It'll look at specifically where they're situated in terms of region, and then it'll set up basically. I can't get too into detail here about how we're actually doing this, but it'll set up like an outbounding strategy essentially to basically connect with that team and create a sort of a pitch around exactly how you could work together, whether that be through them becoming a guardian operator, becoming part of the broader Miden ecosystem, or something along those lines.
Got it. And just to translate it to the rest of the kind of the non-crypto world, it's easy to imagine how any business, small, medium, or large, would want to be very nimble by proactively looking for news and developments. And then if they find that, that's a trigger. And the trigger then starts a workflow of how comms could take advantage of this and speak to others and stuff. All right. I'd love to shift. I'm loving all of this, Elijah. This is just the kind of like concrete use cases I wanted. Oh, let's see. How about your own personal productivity? How are you using AI to keep track of your goals, your schedule, your day? What does your workflow look like? And what is kind of paint a picture for us of when you wake up? Are you the first thing you're doing? Are you looking at like Telegram to communicate with AI agents and giving them instructions and seeing what they've done overnight? Walk through what your kind of AI process looks like and how it impacts your goal and to-do list and process flow and all that stuff.
I think a lot of people would think that my lifestyle is very antithetical to like the AI driven sort of frame that like I present. Cause I like right when I wake up, I'm not on my phone. I'm not on my laptop. I'm not doing
Good for you. That's great. I love hearing that.
To be totally honest with you. But like after a couple hours, I'll usually like my entire workflow and my AI driven development workflows are really focused around the core idea that I can sit down and within a number of hours can have an MVP for practically anything. And so like that's basically the frame that I try to approach things with. And that primarily because I think that if you can find value in something within a day of development for it, you can usually find the energy to focus on it for another several hours or another day or come back to it and kind of pick it up again. Because I can't even tell you the amount of times that I've talked to friends who are into AI driven development as well. And they all share the same sentiment which I have as well for a really long time, but basically just having so many half-baked projects, so many things left on the docket. And so like for me, in terms of like goal management, I have like a task list that I manage for work and basically things that I need to get across the finish line. And those are things that I manage just literally in an Apple Note. But like for the most part, I try to sit down and take an idea from ideation all the way to MVP within like a single day period. When I have an idea, if it's not something that I can really commit to for the next like 3 to 5 hours sitting there and really building it out, it's usually not something that I'll end up using a whole lot, is kind of what I found. And so go ahead.
Can you, what is that? Can you give us a glimpse in what that 3 to 5 hour development period looks like? Where do you start? What's your first driver? You mentioned earlier you might use Claude Design to start there. Is that your typical path? Where are there other times you start in Claude or Chat? Kind of walk through what that kind of like block looks like.
Totally. Yeah. So if I have like a very general idea for like a personal app I want to build, but the sort of like the value prop for it isn't really crystal clear in my mind, I'll usually just turn on Mac Whisper, which is like local transcription. It's basically Whisper Flow, but local. And I'll usually turn on Mac Whisper and I will just talk for like, however long it takes me to get to really the meat of really what I'm wanting to build. An example of something I built more recently is it's like a personal app called Resonance. And basically it hooks into my Whoop. And basically it'll use like the live heart rate broadcast to calculate like my HRV in real time. And then what it'll do is it's basically like a web dashboard where I put on headphones and it'll train me into higher coherence, essentially. So basically a higher HRV state, which isn't exactly coherence, but higher HRV in general. And so there's a lot of apps that do this without HRV tracking, but it's just something that I felt really passionate about building and wanted to build out. And the way I built that, quite honestly, was just basically like, okay, I know exactly what I want to build in terms of like the core problem, which is basically having a third-party application access my web trap. And so I started out with Claude and I said like, is this technically even possible? This is what I want to do. It identified several like GitHub libraries we could use, other people that had done this on Reddit. I developed like a PRD and an architecture brief around it. I dropped that into Claude Design. It built out the actual web UX. I grabbed those zip files, dropped them into Hermes, and then started the auto build process, basically saying to build out this application. And within like, I think 40, 45 minutes, I had like V1. V1 was where it actually showed like what was happening on my Bootstrap. It didn't have the coherence training yet, but that took, I think, another 2-3 hours, something like that, to build in. So I think generally speaking, like you could probably, and I think this is a really exciting time too for people that just like are builders at heart, because you can actually sit down and really have a working application that you can share with the community. You could potentially market. You could potentially like have some sort of partnership with somebody on within realistically a couple of days. And my personal conviction is that like that's where we're heading in terms of company development. Is like you'll probably sit down with somebody who's like, a top 0.0001% marketer, 0.01% dev, 0.01% ops person. And you'll just sit down almost like, it's very similar to like, Rick Rubin doesn't really know how to run a soundboard, I would imagine, or produce music as an engineer, nor does Jay-Z or Kanye. But they're still the one that's directing it. And they're the one that all this value and grandiosity is attributed to. And so I think it's largely going to be along that frame where you'll sit in a room with an AI engineer and you'll just sort of have this idea and go back and forth with other bright minds. And then within a day or two, you'll come out with like a entire company. And inevitably what that'll lead to is higher turn time for companies like as a whole, like, the Amazons of today that will probably last 30 to 40 years as a major company will last maybe 3 to 4 years or something along those lines. But it's still, we're kind of yet to see what will happen in that sphere.
I love that framework. To your point on direction, there's so much of a premium now on directing the workflows and the harnesses and file maintenance and file management and markdown file management, right? How are you thinking about all of that? I'd love to get a little concrete here, because I honestly, it's something I am kind of, I feel like I'm making progress, and I am. I'm like, oh shit, but how do I weave in this tool as well? And if I want to use Hermes, how do I use Hermes, but also use a Claude driver and make sure that my context files all about me and my podcast and my speaking engagements and so on, how are those kept straight? Like what's your system for, you mentioned Claude Design, you mentioned Claude Code, you mentioned Hermes, and actually if you wouldn't mind giving a brief description and definition of that for listeners who are not as Hermes savvy, right? Of like how are you kind of keeping all of that in sync so that and then also, of course, you have your Slackbot agents. Let's hear about how that's wired up, right? How you have agentic flows for yourself personally and also at Miden. And the name of the game, broadly speaking, in my mind, is every time a new chat or whatever it is instance starts up, technically it starts from scratch, right? It has to read context. And so to get, to have a durable workflow where it's like doing a project over a series of instances, and then also if you want to give a new instance, so it's up to speed with the context all about you and your project, that requires an elaborate orchestration of like memory files. Talk about how you are keeping all of that straight and how you're kind of like, which tool, how you use the Hermes tool in conjunction with the Claude tool, and maybe you also use some Codex over here. How are you keeping, and especially given whatever you have figured out on Tuesday might change on Thursday because the tools are changing so fast. Okay, they just dropped /gold. Now, what does that mean with your processes, right? So totally. Anyway, I threw a lot at you, but love to hear your reaction to all of that.
So I think structured file hierarchies, and as it relates to like markdown files and specifically just managing it through Obsidian, is definitely the easiest way to do it in terms of like simplicity. I shouldn't say easy, but it is the most simple, at least in my mind.
Can you define Obsidian for folks who are not using it?
Obsidian is basically just a text editor. It has various visualization features for how you can basically look at your files and see how they connect with one another. But it basically is just a markdown file viewer. And markdown files are just text files with basically formatting inside of them. And essentially, the way to think about it is that you have different like options for how you want to manage memory, right? Whether that's Honcho or Hindsight or various other things, like you can choose to use these APIs. And this is something that like I've kind of, in full transparency, have sort of sworn off, because I think it kind of degrades the agentic experience for development in a lot of ways. Like generally speaking, like I think that a lot of when what you're doing with AI is primarily developing applications, you don't need to have a whole lot of other context associated with your agent outside of your project.md, which can just sit inside the file folder for that project itself, or within the GitHub repo or whatever it might be. And so I think as I shared with you previously, I really take a more modular approach to things now. I'm really quite done, to be honest with you, with having like a super long context.md file or agents.md, where you have all these in tokens that are like 300,000 in tokens, that are just like basically being burned every couple hours or something on those lines, just because you wanted to know every little aspect about your life. I think context management systems, I was actually looking at one right now that I saw on Reddit. It's called Megamente. And so like, I think they're getting better and better and better. But for the most part, like the way that I solve this problem is almost not to solve it. And the way that I do that is basically like have a very structured context.md, Hermes.md, agents.md at the root level for my actual Hermes setup. And then basically I'll have very specific context on what types of projects and what types of carryover I want across those projects, in the sense that if I'm working on something for Miden, there's things that are always going to be evergreen, like our GitHub repos, like our Twitter account, like our basically the way that we do work, the different people within the organization. There's things that are always evergreen within my own personal development infrastructure. And that lives within my Hermes.md on both of my respective Hermes instances, both my personal and work VPS that I use for developing those projects. But for me, I think like at this stage, I really value speed and having a fast instance rather than having to be in a position where I'm dealing with constant bloat and state fatigue, basically, for my agent. Because I think that's when things honestly start to roll down for a lot of people as it relates to third-party harnesses. And I as I shared with you as well, for me, I go through these sort of like really intense periods of like going really, really deep with agentic development and then coming out and kind of reconsolidating and then going back in. And for me, it's just not really worth trying to constantly manage memory. I think that that's when things can get really, really smart if you want to think about it as like a true second brain. But I actually don't think it's really wise to think about AI in that manner. I think it's kind of selling yourself short. And I think it's that cognitive offload is really something that I think a lot of people will notice in the coming years, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah, I share that concern. Although I'm also really excited with the idea of, hey, if I'm able to like everything, and like if I'm able to feed meeting transcripts and able to like, it devours my email, this and that. If it has access to all of this context, and ideally, to your point, Elijah, in like small, tiny, not some one massive bloated file that will like just gobble up tokens, but like a bunch of small nested structured files that are lean. In theory, if that then whatever I throw at, so I start a new chat and it's like instantly knows, great, I can get the speed and all this stuff and help me out, right? That's tempting, but I also share your concern of long term what to do. As we wind down, Elijah, and I could talk to you for 5 hours this stuff, but we're almost out of time, sadly. For folks who are listening who are like, okay, I only understood 40% of that, but that's interesting. That's exciting. I want to do more agentic workflows. I'm not even sure where to start. Like, and honestly, there's still, as I mentioned up top in the intro, OpenAI and Anthropic, frankly, are like behind where you are, right? You are like at the bleeding edge of what you and people like you who are really cleverly fixing harnesses together and so on. That hasn't yet been fully productionalized in an easy to use way. There's not yet, maybe by the time this podcast airs will be, there's no like create agentic flow button in OpenAI or Claude yet, right? And you can get there, but it's not that simple for a newbie. What's your advice to people for how to get started creating agentic workflows, whether what platform to use, how to think about it? What's a concrete thing someone could do tomorrow to get going with agents?
So I'll start with a frame that I think is really helpful and basically like kind of reset how I thought about AI and still do think about it to a very large extent. I'm invested in third-party harnesses and agentic development and learning about memory systems and all these different things because I'm like a true nerd. Like I really love the tech behind it, right? And if I wasn't, I would probably be using it to the degree that I had to use it and no more.
Yeah.
And I think for the majority of people, like, I remember seeing like a couple months back, there was some guy that posted on Twitter a screenshot from a Discord. And this person I don't remember how he was doing it, but he was making like these info products with his $20 a month Claude plan. And he was making like 50 grand a month. And I remember seeing that and like they were using it as an example of these people that are like hyper optimizing across third-party harnesses. And these like, some people have like 4 or 5 different $200 a month Claude 20X plans and things like that. And I think it's a great example of like, not only where there's a will, there's a way, but also just don't lose yourself in the weeds. I think for the majority of people who want to actually get their hands dirty with agentic development and kind of get a sense of like where things are going, my advice, quite honestly, and I literally will tell my family this, friends this, is just talk to the AI itself at the most comfortable level for you. For most people, that's going to be like the desktop app for Claude or chat. And basically just turn on voice mode and just say what you don't understand. Say what you want to do. Say different terms that you've heard and you're not sure where they fit in. Like you'll start to piece it all together as you contextualize and understand how these things fit together. The other thing that I'll say, and I really do advocate
quick injection there. I host on that 1,000%. When I give workshops to companies, one of the main things I say is the best way to figure out how to use AI is to ask AI. AI can be very helpful in that. But the one thing I want to just also add is, since this is moving so fast, a lot of the tools that are useful are not even known by Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini because their training cutoff date is like 3 months ago and things come out. True. So I also ask it, hey, give me advice, but please do research up to today on what's possible. And it'll be, actually, it turns out there are 5 new tools that are helpful. So I would add that little injection in the mix too. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's a great caveat. Yeah. When you don't have like an actual research system built in, having things like that you can actually like call to and reference are really helpful. I think in addition to that, like I think there's a large majority of people that might listen to your pod and might be on Twitter looking at all this AI news that just don't really know where to start. And they probably have messed with Claude and Claude Code on desktop and, Codex maybe even, but they don't really know how far to go with it. I'd really recommend like trying Claude Code on the terminal, realistically speaking. And like Ultra Code is a really fantastic mode that it's a new effort mode that they just launched. Ultra Code is able to spin up like agentic swarms for you. And so like there's been lots of people on Twitter that have, basically spun up swarms of like 200, 300 agents, and they've seen their tasks get done in like a remarkable amount of time. Another thing that I've seen with like, specifically with Claude and Anthropic is that rate limits and sort of like the speed at which you can expect a response is tremendously better since they did the deal with SpaceX. And so like realistically speaking, even though you can't use your Anthropic subscription natively within a third-party harness, I would say that the Claude Code command line experience is very, very, very close to what you'll actually get in terms of like an actual true third-party harness experience with Ultra Code and maybe /goal with something directed along those lines. So if you're in that sort of like messy middle where you're not really sure what to do, I would almost argue like don't play with third-party harnesses yet. Like just start to try to get an idea of what you can do just in the command line with Claude Code, or even with GPT 5.5 and see where you can go with it.
Amazing. Elijah, thank you so much for sharing your playbook, for giving us the kind of like very real talk you don't often see, I think, in the AI space. Really enjoyed talking to you. We'll do a sequel sometime in the future. Thanks again. Best of luck to you and your team at Miden.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Well, there you have it. Thanks again to Elijah Spencer, Chief of Staff at Miden. And thank you to our show's producer, Jasper Chua, and to Garrett Lang for our theme music. And thank you to you, dear listener. If this is your first time at AI Curious, please consider subscribing, rate it 5 stars, send to a friend, all that good stuff. Thanks again, and see you next time.